Hello and welcome to this video. Today's question is, how did the British colonists in North America go from loyal British citizens to fighting a war for independence? There's a lot to unpack, so let's find out.
So I'm going to pick up where she left off. She was talking about the earliest people, how this new world began to be developed and what that looked like. And I'm picking up more this road to revolution. So that's what I'll be talking about. Starting a little bit earlier, trying to again bridge that gap, talking about Jamestown, one of our earliest colonies, settlements, I should say. Made famous by what you've probably all watched, Pocahontas, but not entirely factual, the Disney interpretation there. But they did start to farm tobacco and introduce that into the colonies, and which plays a large role going forward. After that, we saw the Plymouth colony, which you guys all were familiar with when you first started to learn about, Thanksgiving, the origins of Thanksgiving when you were young. The most important thing to remember about those pilgrims, the idea of why they came to these shores for religious freedom. So obviously, one of the most important parts going forward, becoming the First Amendment, the first part of the First Amendment to our Constitution. So obviously, our origins run deep with freedom of religion. The Puritans also played a large role, also coming to these shores for religious freedom. And they gave us sort of those early foundations, establishing really what even government looked like, and that government and church should be separate, and also creating that work ethic of the Puritan sort of backbone. So that also spurred further settlement because they were successful. Then we want to talk about the triangular trade, which has a huge role. So the triangular trade is literally what you see there. Different triangles within. It's not one single triangle, but goods going between Europe and Africa, the West Indies, and the 13 colonies in North America. So the different goods that they had, and one of those goods, in quotes, being people. So slaves being kidnapped, sold into slavery out of Africa, and then taken to the West Indies. And sometimes they stayed in the West Indies, or sometimes they were further shipped sometimes into the northern colonies, but then further sold into slavery in the southern colonies to work in the fields or in the houses. So that is the origin of our country, making us very successful economically, but in doing so, creating this racism that exists still to this day from 400 years ago. And then again, goods being shipped back to Europe. We still weren't big into manufacturing, so they were able to do more of the manufacturing in Europe, and then continued this trade in between the different points. All right, so things were moving along and doing well, but you have to go back and then think about again the early people who came here. So many of the people from Europe came to these shores because the one thing they didn't have that they desperately wanted was land. In Europe, the land was all, scooped up, owned, and you couldn't, even if you had enough money, it wasn't available to buy. And that's the one asset that that this land had was land. So people came here, and they, even once we started to settle and populate the eastern border, they wanted to continue to move further inland. And so we started to have all sorts of conflict with Native Americans. So the different Europeans would try and move westward and get into conflict with Native Americans. And the French had also established forts and had moved more inland with the products that they were taking out of the New World. And so further and further conflict intensifying, culminating in the French and Indian War. And that name is always misleading for students because it's called the French and Indian War. So then sometimes kids think that it's between the French and the Indians, but that wasn't the case. The French and the Indians were allied together against the colonists and the British.
Time out. So, for as long as Europeans have been in contact with the New World, they have been in contact with Native Americans. And this means that Native Americans made treaties, signed trade deals, and interacted with Europeans on a sophisticated level. They also fought wars with them. So, there was this complex situation when going into the War of 1812, where different nations had allied themselves with different European powers for a long time, and a lot of times they would actually play those European powers off of each other. So when we get to the French and Indian War, where the French and British are fighting each other, Native Americans had to kind of choose what side they were going to support. American colonists supported the British, French colonists supported the French, but Native Americans were kind of like, I've gone back and forth a bunch of times. Who am I going to pick? Who has my best interests at heart? And for individual nations, that looked very different. So the British allied with the Iroquois Confederacy, the Catawba Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and the Mohican Nation, while the French allied with the Huron Nation, Shawnee Nation, Ottawa Nation, Delaware Nation, Ojibwa Nation, Abenaki Nation, and actually the Wabanaki Confederacy, which is an interesting case because the Wabanaki Confederacy really waited until their enemies, the Iroquois Confederacy, had chosen their side before they picked a side of the war to be on. They did not want to be fighting on the same side as the Iroquois Confederacy because they were enemies for long before the Europeans had gotten involved in the New World.
So that's who is in conflict. And it was fought for about 7 years. Britain ends up winning and effectively kicking out the French out of the majority of the land that they had been in control of. But in doing so, they accrued a huge debt, which sets the stage for everything that comes after, because who's responsible for that debt? And so the colonists think the British are responsible, the king and parliament are responsible for that debt. But the king and parliament think that, well, we fought to defend you, so you are responsible to repay and create revenue to take care of that debt. And that truly sets the stage for everything that comes. So right after the war, after the British and the colonists won, the king and parliament lay down the proclamation of 1763. And they say, hey, you cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains. So that's just that skinny little sliver of what is the 13 colonies. They say, do not go west past that land, because they don't want them to get into further conflict with the Native Americans and then have to come back and fight again. So they just say, stay put, stay where you are. That proclamation upsets the colonists so much because they think, you don't even understand us. We came here for land, we came here for opportunity, and you are, stymieing our very nature. You're not letting us grow. You don't understand who we are. The other thing is, they really can't enforce it. There's no way that Britain, then Parliament or the King, can stop the colonists from doing it. There's no giant wall. Even if there was, there's ways of getting around walls, right? So they can't truly enforce that. So the colonists continue to push. All right, so back to the idea of that debt. They need to recoup their losses from fighting the French and Indian War. So the king and parliament believe that it's the colonists' responsibility. So they begin to implement all of those acts that you've all heard of before, right? The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Tea Act, but that's yet to come. So let me just start with the idea that all of these acts, the colonists are instantly upset about. They don't care if it's an internal tax within the colonies or if it's an external tax. They're opposed to really all of them. They don't think that they're fair. And they're most especially upset by taxation without representation. So the colonists don't have a representative in parliament. So they don't think it's fair that these taxes are being pushed on them when they didn't have a say in it. And the Stamp Act specifically makes them upset because that is an internal tax on anything that was published, and they don't think that's right. It's an internal tax. What does that have anything to do with Britain at all? This isn't fair. The Stamp Act, another connection, is that because of the Stamp Act, the Sons of Liberty organize. They were really the muscle behind the road to revolution. They rise up and they coordinate and they communicate and they get the colonies all connected, and they push back against Parliament, and the king. So Sam Adams is the leader and gets the colonies to work together. They are also responsible for what you all know about the Boston Tea Party. So that was the Sons of Liberty taking action, including using some violence, tarring and feathering people, burning down public buildings that were British buildings. And when I said tarring and feathering people, like specifically tax collectors. So they were trying to get the king to pay attention. We're not going to take it. They're going to put up with this. They don't think it's fair. They're going to boycott goods, and all of the things that they're doing, including using violence, do get the king's attention. And in fact, the Stamp Act was repealed. They got rid of it. So what does that teach the Sons of Liberty? Okay, our actions are working. They're listening. They hear us. So after that, the king kind of had to save face. Parliament had to save face. So they passed the Declaratory Act. So if you heard that word declaratory, the word declare is in there. So really all that act did was, hey, we're still in charge, and you have to listen to us because I said so. So that's kind of the Declaratory Act. They have the right to make laws without consent. So it's kind of them saving face. The Townshend Acts are up next, and that's a collection of acts, one being the Tea Act, which I already referenced, the Boston Tea Party. So the Tea Act most especially angers, again, Bostonians, because it's cutting out this lively, successful smuggling that was taking place, and it hurt the colonial merchants. They force the colonists to buy tea from a British company, the British East India Company, to help that company out. And the colonists were not very fond of that. They didn't want to pay more for their tea. They're not happy about this. So as you know, the Boston Tea Party takes place because of that. Also within there, I sort of connected those two, but the Boston Massacre. So you guys have also heard of that before. So the Boston Massacre takes place, taxation without representation. Bostonians are feeling particularly targeted. And we see this conflict take place between British soldiers and citizens. 5 people were killed. If you look at different sources, you might find a different number, but they're all really small numbers. So 5 people were killed. Tragic, right? For those families, horrible. But is that a massacre? If you think of that word massacre, mass, right? So we don't consider normally 5 people being killed a massacre. Usually it would be into the double digits, maybe even triple digits. Like that's a big word that means a lot of people. So why was it ever called the Boston Massacre? Sons of Liberty. So Sam Adams, Paul Revere was the Sons of Liberty. They used the Boston Massacre and turned it in, and by naming it the massacre, turned it into propaganda to fan the flames, to get the colonists and the colonies, all 13, north to south, connected. They are shooting at us. They are killing us. We need to be united. And the committees of correspondence between the 13 colonies started after that. So even though, again, tragic situation, they exaggerated what had happened there and united the colonies in doing so. So after the Boston Tea Party, the king not pleased, and so he passes another series of acts, the coercive acts, but the colonists call them the intolerable acts. Like, we will not tolerate this anymore. This is ridiculous. It's too much. We're not going to take it. Back to the Sons of Liberty. So they shut down. This is all directed at Boston because that's where the Tea Party took place. The Boston Massacre had happened there. So Boston's getting hit hard. They shut down the Boston Harbor. They put the Quartering Act into place, which, again, you guys, I'm sure, have heard of, where they're putting soldiers into homes. You don't have the right to say no. You have to house them. You have to feed them. They're going to take your belongings. They're going to eat your food, sleep in your bed. So Boston is basically under martial law. They have no rights, and they're not happy about this. So that pushes, finally, the First Continental Congress to meet. That's a big step. They don't get a lot done, but the fact that they even met is a big deal because that was treason. So if they were caught meeting, conspiring against the king, they would be put to death, and they know this. So the fact that they meet in Philadelphia, by the way, because you would think they'd meet in Boston, but that would have been really risky, right? So they meet in Philadelphia, outside of sort of the king's glare there, and 12 colonies meet up. That's in 1774. And when they're there, the things that take place, they agree to meet again. That's a big deal. The Minutemen begin to prepare in different colonies. They halt trade with England. So those are some of the big things that they do, and they boycott goods. But the big thing is they agree to meet again, which again is huge. And then it's the Second Continental Congress that really makes waves. All right, so we're almost done here. Hang with me. So Second Continental Congress. So these guys do a whole lot, and yet kind of at the tail end. So that's part of the frustration of the experience. So the Second Continental Congress is taking place in Lexington and Concord. You guys have all heard about that. Those battles between the British and the colonists. Nobody's declared war, and yet colonists have already died. So we've been shot at, we've shot back. Again, you've heard Paul Revere, the British are coming. So that's what we're talking about with Lexington and Concord. And we're already fighting, but yet no one has declared war. So incoming the Second Continental Congress. So the first thing they do, they meet in May of 1775. The first thing they do is they write and sign the olive branch petition. The dove, a sign of peace, right? Extending the olive branch. I don't know if you've heard that expression before, but all these things, you see the peace images all over the place. That's what we send to the king. We are British citizens. We're just angry because they're not treating us like British citizens, right? We don't have representation. They're taxing us, but not the people back in England. So we're angry. So we send the king this olive branch. We're sorry. We know we had a fight. We know we shot at you. You shot at us, but let's get back together. That's what we try and do. And the king ignores it. He doesn't even read it. He doesn't respond to it. And that just further infuriates people, most especially, again, Boston is feeling the brunt of the king. But slowly but surely, they're uniting all the colonies, not just Boston, Massachusetts, but all of the colonies to join them. So the Second Continental Congress, they first, the olive branch petition fails. They keep at it. They've already formed a Continental Army. Who do they put in charge? George Washington, or as we affectionately like to call him, G-Wash. He is the general in charge of our army. And eventually all 13 colonies get there. The big thing that they accomplish is that Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, formally declaring to the king, to all the colonies, here is why we're mad. These are the points. This is why we are declaring our independence. And it's also something that we need to send to Europe so that we get some allies to fight, which plays a huge role getting France on board on our side. Now, Jefferson, I'm not going to say he plagiarized, but he did not think of all of these ideas on his own. And I don't know that he cited or quoted his ideas, but he got a lot of his ideas from Common Sense. Common Sense was a pamphlet. And even though we would look at it now and think that is some crazy language, at the time, Thomas Paine, he was anonymous at the time, but Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. And he wrote it in a language that the people of the time who could read and write could understand. So they read, and that's why he called it Common Sense. He's like, this isn't hard to understand. It's common sense. The king is doing this, and we have to respond. The king isn't doing this, we have to respond. Like, he made it make sense for the people, and that further united the colonists. So again, Thomas Paine wrote that, but Thomas Jefferson took a lot of those words in writing the Declaration of Independence. And at that point, even though we'd already begun fighting, but at that point, the Revolutionary War begins. And you know what year that happened in? 1776. Thank you.
So now, armed with the information that you've learned throughout this video, let's head back to that question we asked at the beginning. How did the British colonists in North America go from loyal British citizens to fighting a war for independence? What do you think?